So, welcome everyone. And today we are in our podcast series with Middle East Insights. I'm Dr. Shubda Chaudhary, and today we are very, very privileged to have Ryan Bohl with us. And to start with, he is a brief introduction of him, which is that he is a senior Middle East and North African analyst at RANE, where he focuses on strategic, demographic, social, diplomatic, and political issues in the greater MENA region. His area of expertise is particularly on the behaviors of GCC member states, the Levant, Syria, Turkey, Israel, Yemen, and aspects of US Middle Eastern policy. Ran also holds a bachelor's and master's degree in political science from Arizona State University. He has lived and worked in UAE and Qatar, and he has been cited as a regional expert at various publications like AP, Bloomberg, Time Magazine. He's also active on Twitter, and you can follow him on LinkedIn too. So thank you so much, sir. And we'll start with the first question is that how do you perceive that the American citizens, though they do not elect the president, but how would the citizens perceive Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as for the Democrat nominee in the upcoming election?
Well, I just want to say thank you for having me today. It's great to have new contacts, new friends, and have new discussions. And we can start off with what's happening here in the U.S. with this very tumultuous election season. We've got to remember already a bunch of unprecedented things have happened. President Donald Trump was convicted felony in early June. That would have been the story of the summer. And then we had our disastrous debate between Biden and Trump, where Biden was more or less told he needed to step down after that. Yes. And we had an assassination attempt on Trump, and then we had Biden stepping down. So there's been a lot of events that have been taking place that I think have upended a lot of people's perceptions of this election. But in spite of all these unprecedented events, a lot of minds were already made up before this. Trump is a very known quantity to the country. He was already president once. So there's no surprises there. So a lot of people who were already for him didn't change their minds. The people who were against him certainly didn't change their minds. There's that middle narrow ground of folks that are somewhat squishy here and there. Since Harris took over as the Democratic nominee, which I believe was earlier this week officially, there's been something of what you might call it a vibe shift, where people, especially on the Democratic side, are feeling more enthusiastic. They're feeling like they have a real shot at this. Some of the polls are suggesting that she's polling a little bit better. But the reality is that so many people's minds were already made up. It's hard to tell whether or not this is media hype or if this is actual political games. And it's still going to be a narrow contest. It is still going to be very much boiling down to a handful of states, including the one I'm in, Pennsylvania, is going to be a critical state given the how the Electoral College works. So it will still be a narrow contest, and still things can happen between now and November. And so much has already happened in the summer that I think, in spite of the positive wind that we're kind of seeing for the Democrats right now, a lot could change. And so I would still call it a toss-up race at the moment.
So what happened to her in Michigan yesterday?
In Michigan,
like there were a few pro-Palestine protesters that were.
Right. Yeah. He told them to quiet down. And that's what myself as a Middle Eastern, North Africa watcher, that's what I'm looking for, is to see signs of whether or not she's going to be substantially different from Biden. Yeah. Comment was sort of Biden-esque in certain ways. Yes. She viewed it as, if you want Trump to win, keep doing what you're doing. Yes. And that suggests that she's going to position herself as a champion of both Israeli security, but also Palestinian rights. I don't know how she's going to square that on a policy front, but I think that's the narrative that she wants to go for, is that Trump will be worse for Palestinians. He will be more unstable for Israelis. I'm a much better bet to manage this conflict than he is. And I think that's a little different than Biden, who was much more comfortable being stridently pro-Israel, just being straight pro-Israel, concerned about humanitarianism and human rights as a general principle, but not particularly an advocate for the Palestinians or the Palestinian national movement. I think Harris feels compelled to address Palestinians more directly. And we do know that she met with some Palestinian Americans, some Arab Americans in Michigan. where she said, we will keep talking about these things. That is different than Biden, who more or less didn't have much of a dialogue with those groups. So I wouldn't expect things like arms embargoes or severe cutoff from the U.S. from her. But I think she's going to have a narrative that tries to suggest to certain people that she might, because I think she recognizes that that's politically advantageous for her.
And what about her choice as the VP, Tim Walz? What kind of change does he represent?
He tends to be more of a domestic, we would call him a domestic progressive in the American political context. He's a little bit more on the liberal side. Maybe not left. You might not call him left, given some of his positions, because left in the United States can mean some pretty relatively extreme things that I don't think the Democratic Party embraces very often. Yeah. But he's more of a liberal progressive. And I think he was chosen because they believe that, one, he has a good personality to contrast with Trump's vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance. Yeah. That's always, the role of the vice president is a popularity contest. Yeah. And two is that he's got experience campaigning in Midwestern states like Minnesota. Yeah. And those are the really critical states that the Harris campaign knows they have to capture. They have to get Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And if they don't get all four of those states, their path to victory is very, very difficult, if not impossible.
So do you think that she's ready for Chicago now?
As ready as she can be. I think this was very sudden. She did, of course, 2020 as she didn't have support really in 2020, but that was Biden's year. And it was really a Biden versus Bernie Sanders contest, and everybody else was just on the stage. And so she was just an also ran that year. So she's got some experience with this, but I think she's as ready as she can be. I think that she will be able to take advantage of this positive sentiment of behind her. And then it's just a question of whether or not she can handle interviews, handle speeches. And if she can do the bare minimum on that, if she can perform better than Biden, I think she'll maintain that positive momentum, at least within the party.
Okay. And what do you see? What suddenly happened? Because the media has stopped reporting about the Columbia University and other university uprisings that took place. So what happened to those protest movements?
Well, the shortest answer is school was let out and students went home. So the protest movements aren't gone, but I think they've gone online for the most part because school's no longer in session. So that's the simplest thing. There were several states that carried out expansive crackdowns. Texas, for example, was sending in the police and arresting students. And of course, Columbia did too. So there was also a crackdown element that has pooped away student protesters. The other major problem that I think the activist movement is having is they had some relatively clean narratives in Gaza based on the news when there was still territory that Israel had not yet entered, like Rafah. That was the last big narrative, hands off Rafah, right? Remember that one? And the Israelis went into Rafah and they continue to go Rafah back and forth. It's harder now for the activist movement to point to a single event that will generate energy from the people they need out in the streets. The activists themselves don't need any convincing. It's really the bystanders that need convincing. And it's hard to do when the Israelis now have, they don't have full control of Gaza by any stretch of the imagination, but they've moved into every territory. There is no sort of last safe zone that hasn't been violated at this point. It's all been done before, and it's easy to lose track of things. So I think that the Israelis now have that media advantage, that Gaza is now a difficult narrative to tell and a difficult story to record because it's moved out of its conventional military phase and it's moving into an insurgency phase. And so I think the activists are going to struggle with that. That being said, some of them will probably come back when school comes back in a session starting next month after Labor Day here in September. And the other is that if Israel does end up either in a regional conflict or the United States gets pulled into that conflict, or Israel invades Lebanon, that's where the activists, I think, are going to have another big narrative to point to Israel as a liability for the U.S., as a human rights problem, many other things that I think will generate that protest movement again.
A lot of Israeli supporters believe that the Palestinian cause is just a Trojan horse for the greater Islamist movements that want to establish their own caliphate and enforce their regressive regimes, especially on women and other minorities. Do you believe so?
I don't see it quite that simplistically. I don't think there is a major challenge for the Palestinian national movement, such as it is, in that it is fractured. It has more than one faction, and that's the major issue. Is you probably don't have very many factions within the Palestinian movement that you would qualify as liberal or leftist that have particularly strong public support. Hamas, I would qualify as a far-right faction, very similar to Israel's far-right. Osma Yehuda, to the finance minister, was saying, let's let all the Gazans starve. So Israel has that exact same faction also in government. And in that case, those sorts of folks are always going to be seeking conflict. They'll always be seeking power and authority as much as they can. That's the nature of far-right movements. These movements can moderate over time. Hamas looked like they might have been before October 7th. There were a lot of people, including myself, that were looking at Hamas is more interested in governing Gaza. They're more interested in escalating against Israel to earn concessions from Israel. They're looking like they're moving into more of a right wing rather than far right faction. And then October 7th came, and we saw that ideological change had not taken place. For other groups like Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, they're nationalists, they're right-wing nationalists, they're pretty traditional. They accept that Israel should exist. They accept that they need to have working relations with Israel. They obviously take taxes collected by Israel that they collect on their behalf. They do security cooperation. They won't always have cordial relations with the Israelis, but they don't have the same outlook as Hamas does, which clearly is now in the moment seeking still to have conflict. So for the Palestinians, for people who make the argument that any Palestinian state will automatically be a Hamas state, it seems more likely that a Palestinian state might be a fractured state and an ineffective one that would need to be propped up by the international community. It might resemble in some cases like Lebanon, where paralysis is very, very normal, and everyone is one step away from conflict, rather than it being converted into an ISIS state, which I don't think is very likely. ISIS and Al-Qaeda have a very small following in the Palestinian communities. So really, I think it's a disingenuous argument, but it does hint towards the idea that the Palestinian national movement has its own internal problems that I think have to be addressed, both with an international component and with Palestinians themselves leading the way.
No, that's true, because even in West Bank, for example, under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, the elections were delayed. And the successor for Mahmoud Abbas is still, debatable. And Dehlan is taking maximum, benefit of it, trying to curate his own networks in UAE and other states. But at the same time, I was surprised when in the Beijing declaration, they had 14 representatives come together. And I was like, who are these 14 different representatives of the Palestinian cause? And I didn't have complete knowledge of it. But turning to one of the important aspects of the American election is also the money or the funding or the cash inflows, which are essential for any presidential nominee, for which many of the lobbies, be it the gun lobby or the evangelical lobby or the APAC, they play a pivotal role. So recently, the ex-CEO of WhatsApp also donated billions of dollars to the APEC lobby. So how do you see that this kind of lobbying would impact whatever policy Harris, if she becomes the first woman president of US, would take?
Yeah, I would say, and on the APAC and on the Israel lobbying and the direct donations, I would always nuance that or hedge that with the reality that Americans view Israel they view it through a strategic prism, a religious prism, historical and cultural prism. And then the money is what feeds those narratives. So we've got to remember a substantial number of Americans, especially American evangelicals, view Israel religiously, like it needs to exist so that they can cause the apocalypse and have the Messiah come back and all of that. That's critical in their worldview. And so no amount of money is going to change their mind. Their mind is already made up. You don't have to spend money on that block. And the Republican Party has been very good at porting that base. There's this strategic angle. Israel is still a strategic partner of the U.S. There are many different defense jobs that go through this Israel connection, buying back and forth. That's key for states like Arizona, where I'm originally from. A lot of folks work with contractors with Israel connections. So that matters as well. Plus, Israel is the only power in the region that's willing to help the United States directly balance Iran. No other country in the region is willing to take the action right now. You make the argument that they're doing too much. But Saudi and Turkey are certainly not going to balance Iran the way that Israel is willing to. And that's also of enormous strategic value to the U.S. So what AIPAC is able to do very effectively is direct that sentiment for specific candidate races that have an impact. And I think the best one was just a couple of days ago with a progressive named Cori Bush out of St. Louis. She lost her race. Now, she lost her race because she also was not an ideal candidate for that local area. She was talking national issues, and her constituents wanted her to talk more often about local ones.
Local issues.
There was lots of money that allowed an opposition candidate from within the same party, wasn't a Republican, it was another Democrat, to unseat her in a primary. And I think that's where the Israel lobby is most effective, is that they understand the United States, they understand the political system, they understand where change is possible and where change is not, and they spend that money as strategically as possible. But I'll also say that they're wasting a lot of their money lately, because there is a grassroots change taking place in the Democratic Party where those old narratives don't make sense or they don't work, especially for younger Americans, especially for college-aged Americans, but also just on a macro geopolitical front. Israel does not have the same value to the U.S. in the year 2024 as it did, say, in 1994 or 1984. It used to help the United States balance Soviet-backed Arab states. That's no longer the case. It used to be a viable partner for trying to fight the global war on terrorism. That was seen at least in that way. The global war on terrorism is more or less petered out. Now it's a regional problem, and there's a very notable argument, taking place that specifically this Israeli government is outside of America's interests. It's going rogue, and that's why people like Senator Chuck Schumer have called for new elections in Israel for the very first time, saying that it's Netanyahu who is driving the country off the rails. And so I think that is a substantial change, and I think it's hurting AIPAC's dollar return of how much money they need to spend to keep Israel in a secure place where they don't have to face any American sanctions or arms cutoffs.
So do you think, coming to Netanyahu, do you think that any kind of hostage deal or a ceasefire is possible right now? Because Israel itself is not a homogeneous entity. It has so many factions. And so many factions are now, there are so many youngsters who right now they passed an act in which the Haredim Jews who had to be now enlisted in the military conscription, those who are religious, which was not initially there. And there are a lot of, the left in Israel, there are a lot of Palestinian Jews also, and so many other narratives. And so it's not a homogeneous entity which Netanyahu is trying to provoke and create. So do you think that Netanyahu, because his own war cabinet and his own, support base with the allegations against him of corruption and everything coming up, and the hostages not returning, do you think that Netanyahu has that kind of gravity which he had maybe, say, in 2009 or 5 years before or whatever?
I would describe Netanyahu as more or less a zombie politician. It's just waiting for him to die. He's held together by a faction that is more afraid of the opposition than they are afraid of what Netanyahu could do to their own credibility. The far right, Otzma Yehudit, religious Zionism, those guys know that they have no other coalition partners besides Netanyahu, that if they go to a new election, they might lose seats, and they definitely will be shut out of the next government. So they don't have an incentive to leave the government. And the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox parties, they're very angry about being conscripted, but they also know that, again, if they leave the government, who else are they going to go to? There's no other factions that are going to work with them. It really boils down to the question of what we would call the center-right in Israel, and that kind of is embodied in the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who's more of a center-right kind of guy. How much tolerance they have for Netanyahu's behavior before they decide that it is time to leave the government and bring it down. And that goes towards the ceasefire question, which is the far right doesn't want a ceasefire. Netanyahu doesn't really want to lose the far right because the ceasefire is one of the few things they might leave the government over. So he has an incentive to drag out these negotiations for as long as possible and to see if the IDF can recover these hostages in military operations. And they've done a few here and there. I'd have to double check the exact numbers, but I think they've killed more hostages than they've rescued. But he is willing to do that strategy because unless Hamas gives him his maximalist demands, which is more or less that Hamas surrenders and goes into exile, unless Hamas agrees to that, the far right will not be appeased, because the far right, they don't want just a ceasefire in Gaza. They don't want just the hostages to be returned. They want to recolonize Gaza. They want to rebuild the settlements. They've openly said as much. They've had rallies about it. They have lots of settlers who are setting up plans for going back to the old settlements within Gaza, and some of them want to displace the Palestinians from there. And the only way that can happen is if there's enough fighting in the Gaza Strip where the civilian infrastructure is destroyed, there's high enough casualties, that in the post-war scenario, most Palestinians choose to migrate to the West Bank. And then that would open up the space for Israeli colonization of that area. And as long as that's the case, as long as they are the key partner watching, a ceasefire process is very, very difficult to see happening. But at the same time, I think when we think about it from the Hamas perspective, Hamas's victory in the Gaza war goes through politics. It doesn't go through the military solution. Militarily, they can run an insurgency against Israel, but they can't defeat the Israeli military. But they can achieve a political victory by just surviving in Gaza in some capacity. And the only way they survive is through a ceasefire. And that ceasefire is something that I think even the new leader, Yahya Sinwar, the military leader, he wants a political victory too. That would be a huge achievement for the movement. And that does mean that he still has a vested interest in a ceasefire. So if the Israeli side can move away from this reliance on the far right faction to stabilize its politics, a ceasefire becomes more doable. But so long as that far right stands in the way, a ceasefire is more or less dead in the water, and the Israelis will keep adding new demands to it.
Well, turning to Hamas now,